Sometimes the loneliest people are those surrounded by others who refuse to see them. For 15 years, Samuel Thorne lived in a world of silence, while everyone around him simply looked away. The townsfolk of Cedar Ridge, Colorado Territory, crossed streets to avoid the big deaf mountain man. They whispered about him, called him dangerous, treated him like he wasn't even human. Samuel learned to live alone in the high country, trapping and trading just enough to get by. He built his cabin far from town, where no one had to pretend to understand him. Then one autumn morning in 1885, everything changed. A 10-year-old orphan girl named Clara stepped off the stagecoach. Her small hands moved in graceful signs, and her bright eyes searched the crowd. What happens when someone finally speaks your language after years of silence? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Samuel Thorne hadn't always lived like a ghost among the living. 28 years ago, he'd been the youngest foreman at the Silver Creek mine, a strapping 25-year-old with calloused hands and dreams of striking it rich. His wife, Margaret, would pack his lunch in the blue tin pail every morning, kissing his cheek before he walked down the mountain to the mine entrance. Their 2 children, little Thomas and baby Sarah, would wave from the cabin window, their faces pressed against the glass like tiny suns. The explosion that took his hearing also took everything else that mattered. The mine collapsed on a Tuesday in March, trapping Samuel under tons of rock for 3 days. When they finally dug him out, the world had gone permanently silent, and his family, God rest their souls, had perished in the avalanche triggered by the blast. The same avalanche that buried their cabin, their dreams, and any reason Samuel had to stay connected to the hearing world. Now, at 53, Samuel's hands told the story of his solitary years. They were gnarled from setting traps in mountain streams, scarred from skinning pelts by lantern light, and strong from chopping wood that would warm only him through the brutal Colorado winters. His beard had gone grey, and his eyes, once bright with hope, had settled into the resigned squint of a man who expected nothing good from his fellow humans. The worn leather gloves he wore everywhere had belonged to his father, a gift passed down when Samuel was barely 16. He'd kept them all these years, even as the leather cracked and the stitching came loose. They were the last tangible connection to a time when hands were meant for building, not just surviving. Cedar Ridge had grown from a rough mining camp to a proper frontier town in the years since Samuel's accident. False-fronted buildings lined Main Street, housing Tom Bradley's general store, the Frontier Saloon, Doc Henderson's practice, and the whitewashed church where Preacher Williams delivered sermons to increasingly respectable families. The railroad had brought civilization, and with it came people who didn't remember the old Samuel, the one who used to laugh loud enough to wake the mountains. Tom Bradley, now pushing 60 himself, was one of the few who remembered those days. He'd been Samuel's friend once, before the accident changed everything. Tom still nodded when Samuel came to trade his furs for supplies, still counted out his change with patience, but the easy conversation was gone. How do you talk to a man who can't hear your words and won't meet your eyes? He gives me the shivers, Tom's wife Martha would whisper to the other women after Samuel left the store. The way he just stares at nothing, like he's seeing ghosts. Poor soul, Mrs. Henderson would reply, though her voice carried more fear than pity. Living up there all alone. It ain't natural. The children were the worst. They'd scattered like startled birds whenever Samuel appeared on Main Street, their mothers pulling them close with sharp warnings about the wild man from the mountain. Samuel had learned to time his trips to town for early morning or late evening, when the streets were mostly empty and he could conduct his business without causing a commotion. Sheriff Jake Morrison, a practical man in his 40s, kept an eye on Samuel but never saw reason for concern. The mountain man caused no trouble, broke no laws, and seemed content to live his hermit's existence. Still, Jake noticed how the town held its breath whenever Samuel was around, as if his silence was something that might be catching. The wooden cross, tucked away in Samuel's cabin, had been his mother's, carved by his father during their first winter in Colorado territory. Samuel hadn't prayed in 28 years, hadn't felt the presence of any benevolent God since the day the mountain took everything he loved. But he couldn't bring himself to burn the cross or throw it away. It sat in a drawer beneath his winter clothes, wrapped in one of Margaret's old handkerchiefs, like hope preserved in mothballs. His daily routine had become as predictable as sunrise. Up before dawn, check the trap lines, skin and prepare any caught animals, return to the cabin for a meal eaten in perfect silence. Afternoons were for chopping wood, mending equipment, or reading the few books he owned by the light of his window. He taught himself to read lips somewhat, but books were easier, words that stayed still long enough for him to understand them completely. Evenings. He'd sit on his porch when weather allowed. Watching the sun set over the peaks, he knew better than any man alive. Sometimes he'd see the lights of Cedar Ridge twinkling in the valley below and remember what it felt like to be part of something larger than himself. Those were the hardest moments, when the silence felt less like peace and more like punishment. The autumn of 1885 had been particularly harsh, with early snows forcing Samuel to extend his trap lines higher into the mountains. He'd been tracking a family of beavers up Willow Creek when he first saw the stagecoach arrive in Cedar Ridge, dust trailing behind it like a brown ribbon in the valley below. From his perch among the aspens, he watched through his father's old spyglass as passengers climbed down to stretch their legs. Most were the usual travelers, businessmen, families heading west, the occasional drifter looking for work. But something made him linger on the small figure that emerged last from the coach. A child, no more than 10 or 11, with auburn hair catching the afternoon light. She stood apart from the other passengers, her head turning this way and that, as if she were listening to something the others couldn't hear. Or perhaps, Samuel thought with bitter recognition, she was experiencing the same kind of isolation he knew so well. The girl's hands moved in quick, fluid gestures as she looked around the town square. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. Those weren't random movements, they were signs. Deliberate, practiced, beautiful in their precision. She was speaking a language he recognized, one he'd tried to learn years ago from a traveling missionary before giving up in frustration and despair. He watched as the girl was met by Mrs. Crawford, the stern woman who ran the orphanage on the edge of town. Even from this distance, Samuel could see the child's shoulders slump as she was led away from the stagecoach toward the large, grey building that housed Cedar Ridge's unwanted children. That night, as Samuel sat by his fire with a cup of coffee grown cold in his hands, he couldn't stop thinking about the girl's graceful signs. For 28 years, he'd lived in a world where communication meant pointing, writing notes, or the occasional frustrated gesture that no one bothered to interpret. But this child, this small stranger, spoke a language designed for silence. The thought followed him into restless sleep. And when he woke the next morning, Samuel found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He prayed, not to the God who had taken his family and his hearing, but to whatever force in the universe might still care about broken things finding their way back together. He had no idea that his prayer was about to be answered in ways he never could have imagined, or that the small girl with the dancing hands would soon change everything he thought he knew about the possibility of connection in a silent world. The storm came without warning, as mountain storms often do. One moment, the October sky was clear and bright. The next, it was bruised purple with clouds that rolled over the peaks like Judgment Day. Samuel felt the pressure change in his bones and hurried to secure his cabin before the worst of it hit. He was checking his woodpile when he saw her, a small figure stumbling through the trees below his cabin, her auburn hair whipping in the wind. The girl from the stagecoach, the one who spoke with her hands. She was soaked through, her dress clinging to her thin frame, and she moved with the desperate exhaustion of someone who'd been walking for hours. Samuel didn't hesitate. He'd seen too many people die in these mountains to worry about propriety or what the town might think. He ran down the slope, his boots sliding on wet pine needles, and reached the girl just as she collapsed against a fallen log. Up close, she was even smaller than he'd thought, with dark circles under green eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. Her lips were blue with cold, and her hands shook as she tried to sign something he couldn't understand through her exhaustion. Samuel scooped her up, surprised by how light she was, and carried her up to his cabin. Inside, he wrapped her in his warmest blanket and built up the fire until the room glowed with heat. He heated water for tea and found a can of soup that he warmed over the flames. When the girl's shivering finally stopped, she looked up at him with those grave green eyes and slowly, carefully, moved her hands in the sign he recognized. "Thank you." Samuel's heart nearly stopped. In 28 years of silence, no one had ever spoken to him in a language meant for quiet. He sat down heavily on his wooden chair and stared at this child who had just bridged a chasm he'd thought was permanent. Carefully, clumsily, he tried to remember the signs the missionary had shown him all those years ago. His hands felt thick and clumsy as he formed what he hoped was, "You're welcome." The girl's face lit up like sunrise, and she began signing more rapidly, her hands dancing in the firelight. Samuel caught only fragments, something about running, about being afraid, about someone named Uncle Charles. But it didn't matter that he couldn't understand everything. What mattered was that she was trying to talk to him, treating him like a human being capable of conversation. Samuel found paper and pencil and wrote, "What's your name?" She took the pencil with small, careful fingers and wrote back in surprisingly neat handwriting, "Clara Pemberton. I'm sorry I came to your cabin. I got lost in the storm." "Not sorry," Samuel wrote. "You're safe now." Clara read his words and nodded, then wrote, "Are you the man from the mountain? The one everyone in town whispers about?" Samuel's face darkened. He'd hoped the child might have been spared the town's gossip about him. He wrote, "I suppose I am. Does that frighten you?" Clara shook her head vigorously and wrote, "No, you saved me. And you understand my hands." She paused, then added, "Most people pretend they don't see when I sign." That simple sentence hit Samuel like a physical blow. Here was someone who understood what it meant to be ignored, to have your attempts at communication dismissed as if they didn't matter. She was just a child, but she already knew the particular loneliness of being unheard. Samuel wrote, "How did you learn to sign?" "My parents," Clara wrote. "They were both deaf. They died in a fire 2 years ago. I've been in 3 different orphanages since then. I ran away from all of them." Samuel studied the girl's face as she wrote, noting the way her jaw set with determination, even as sadness flickered in her eyes. She had the look of someone who'd learned early that the world wasn't necessarily kind to people like them. "Why did you run this time?" He wrote. Clara hesitated, then wrote, "Mrs. Crawford doesn't like it when I sign. She says it's unseemly and that I need to learn to act normal. She hits my hands with a ruler when she catches me." Clara rolled up her sleeves to show red welts across her knuckles and wrists. Samuel's hands clenched into fists. The torn photograph in his shirt pocket, half of his old family portrait, crinkled against his chest. He'd carried it for 28 years, a reminder of what he'd lost. But looking at this brave, battered child, he thought of all the family connections that were broken not by tragedy, but by cruelty and ignorance. Outside, he could hear voices calling through the storm. The search party had come looking for the missing orphan, and they'd be furious when they found her in his cabin. Samuel could imagine what they'd think. The wild mountain man who'd finally done something truly dangerous. "They're coming for you," Samuel wrote. Tilting his head toward the door, Clara's eyes widened with panic. She grabbed the pencil and wrote quickly, "Please don't let them take me back. Mrs. Crawford will punish me terribly for running away, and she'll make sure I never use my hands to talk again." The desperation in her handwriting, the way she gripped the pencil like it was her last connection to the world, reminded Samuel of himself in those dark days after the mine collapse. The way he'd tried to cling to any scrap of his old life, only to have it slip away, piece by piece. The voices were getting closer now. Samuel could see lantern light through his window, and he knew that in moments his door would be pounded by fists, demanding the return of the missing child. They'd assumed the worst of him, as they always did. They'd never believed that he'd simply helped a lost child find shelter from a storm. Clara was watching his face, reading the conflict there. She set down the pencil and began to sign, slowly and clearly, so he could follow. "I'm not afraid of you. You're the first person in 2 years who's tried to talk to me instead of talking about me." Samuel looked at this small, fierce girl who'd stumbled into his life like an answered prayer he'd never thought to voice. In her face, he saw his own long-buried hope for connection, for understanding, for a world where being different didn't mean being alone. The pounding on his door began, aggressive and demanding. Sheriff Morrison's voice carried through the wood. "Samuel Thorne, open this door. We know the girl's in there." Samuel looked at Clara, then at the door, then back at Clara. For 28 years, he'd let the world tell him what he was worth, let them decide that his silence made him less than human. But this child saw something different in him. She saw someone worth talking to. He stood up, walked to the door, and prepared to face whatever came next. But this time, he wouldn't be facing it alone. Samuel opened the door to find Sheriff Morrison, Tom Bradley, and 3 other men from town standing on his porch, their faces grim in the lantern light. Behind them, barely visible through the rain, Mrs. Crawford waited with her arms crossed and her mouth set in a hard line. "Evening, Samuel," Sheriff Morrison said, his voice carefully neutral. "We're looking for a girl who went missing from the orphanage. Clara Pemberton, 10 years old, auburn hair. Have you seen her?" Samuel nodded and stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. Clara sat by the fire, wrapped in his blanket, looking smaller than ever, surrounded by the stern-faced adults. But her chin was raised, and her green eyes held steady as they fell upon her. "Clara Marie Pemberton." Mrs. Crawford's voice cut through the warm air like winter wind. "You've caused quite a commotion, young lady. Gather yourself. We're going home immediately." Clara shook her head and began to sign rapidly. Mrs. Crawford's face flushed red with anger. "Stop that nonsense this instant." "How many times must I tell you?" "What's she saying?" Sheriff Morrison interrupted, watching Clara's hands with curiosity rather than irritation. Samuel picked up his pencil and paper, writing quickly. "She's saying she doesn't want to go back, that she's afraid." Afraid. Tom Bradley stepped forward, his shopkeeper's instincts for fairness overriding his discomfort with Samuel. "Afraid of what?" Clara had been watching Samuel write, and now she reached for the pencil herself. In careful handwriting she wrote, "Mrs. Crawford hits my hands when I sign. She says speaking with my hands is the devil's work. But it's how my parents taught me to talk. It's how I remember them." The men in the room shifted uncomfortably. Sheriff Morrison frowned at Mrs. Crawford, who drew herself up with righteous indignation. "The child needs discipline," she said firmly. "She has wild ideas about that hand-waving nonsense. A proper Christian girl speaks with her voice, not with unseemly gestures." Samuel was writing again, his hand moving faster than usual. She wasn't gesturing. She was speaking, in a language you don't understand. Language? Tom Bradley looked between Samuel and Clara. "You mean there's actually meaning to what she's doing with her hands?" Clara nodded eagerly and began to sign again, this time slowly and deliberately. She pointed to Samuel, then made a sign, then pointed to herself and made the same sign. Then she picked up the pencil and wrote, "We both said hello. Same word, different way." The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the steady drum of rain on the roof. Samuel watched the men's faces as understanding began to dawn. They were seeing Clara, really seeing her, for perhaps the first time. "Well, I'll be," Sheriff Morrison said quietly. "She's been trying to talk to folks all along, hasn't she?" Samuel nodded and wrote, "Her parents were deaf. This is her first language." Mrs. Crawford stepped forward, her face stern. "That's quite enough of this foolishness. Clara, come along. We have rules at the orphanage for good reason." But Clara didn't move. Instead, she looked up at Samuel and signed something that made him blink in surprise. Then she wrote on the paper, "I asked if I could stay here, just for tonight. Because of the storm, the request hung in the air like smoke. Samuel could feel the weight of the town's judgment, their assumptions about what kind of man would want to keep a young girl in his cabin. But he could also see the hope in Clara's eyes, the desperate need for one place in the world where she could be herself. "That's highly irregular," Mrs. Crawford said sharply. "The child belongs at the orphanage." "Actually," Sheriff Morrison said slowly, "the child belongs wherever she's safest and best cared for." He looked around the warm, clean cabin, noting the soup bowl by Clara's chair and the careful way Samuel had wrapped her in his warmest blanket. "Seems to me she's been well looked after here." Samuel reached into his shirt pocket and carefully pulled out the torn photograph, half of his family portrait from before the mine accident. He showed it to Clara first, then to the others. On the paper he wrote, "I had a daughter once, Sarah. She'd be about Clara's age now." The photograph was worn soft from years of handling, creased and faded, but still showing the face of a little girl with bright eyes and a gap-toothed smile. Clara studied it carefully, then looked up at Samuel with understanding. From her own pocket she pulled a small silver locket, the only thing she'd managed to keep through all her moves between orphanages. Inside was a tiny photograph of a man and woman, their hands positioned in elegant signs, their faces full of love and pride. Clara showed the locket to Samuel first, then to the others. "My parents," she wrote. "They taught me that hands can speak love just as well as voices can." Tom Bradley cleared his throat. "Samuel, you sure about this? Taking care of a child is a big responsibility." Samuel looked at Clara, at her brave face and determined chin, at the way she held her parents' picture like a treasure. He thought about the 28 years he'd spent believing he had nothing left to offer the world, nothing worth sharing. Then he picked up the pencil and wrote in large, clear letters, "I'm sure." Mrs. Crawford sputtered in protest, but Sheriff Morrison held up a hand. "Now, Edna, let's think about this practical-like. The girl's been running away from every placement we've tried. Maybe what she needs is somewhere she feels understood, but he's deaf." Mrs. Crawford protested. "How can he properly raise a child when he can't even hear if she calls for help?" Clara's hands moved in quick, sharp signs that Samuel was beginning to recognize as anger. She wrote on the paper, "He hears me better than anyone ever has." The truth of that statement settled over the room like evening settling over the mountains. Samuel had heard Clara in ways that went beyond sound, had understood her need for safety and acceptance without requiring words to explain it. "Tell you what," Sheriff Morrison said finally, "let's try a trial arrangement. Clara can stay here for a week, and I'll check in every day. If everything's going well, we'll talk about making it more permanent." Samuel nodded gravely. It was more than he'd dared hope for, and less than Clara deserved, but it was a beginning. A chance for both of them to prove that different didn't mean wrong, that silence didn't mean empty. As the search party prepared to leave, Clara signed thank you to each of them, her hands graceful in the firelight. Some of the men tried to sign back, their movements clumsy but sincere. It was a start. The morning after the storm dawned clear and crisp, with golden aspen leaves scattered across the ground like nature's own confetti. Samuel woke to find Clara already up, sitting cross-legged by the window and watching the sunrise paint the peaks in shades of rose and amber. Her small hands moved in what he was beginning to recognize as morning prayers, silent words of gratitude spoken in graceful gestures. He made breakfast for two, something he hadn't done in nearly 3 decades. Clara helped by setting the table with careful precision, arranging his few dishes as if they were fine china. She'd found his father's brass compass on the shelf and was examining it with the intense curiosity of childhood. "My father's," Samuel wrote when he saw her interest. He used it to find his way through these mountains when he first came west. Clara studied the compass, watching the needle swing toward magnetic north. She wrote back, "Did he ever get lost?" "Many times. But he always found his way home." Something in Clara's expression told Samuel she understood the deeper meaning behind those words. They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, communicating through small gestures and shared smiles. Clara showed him more signs, simple ones for good, Thank you. More. And Samuel tried to copy her movements with his work-roughened hands. There, peaceful morning was interrupted by hoofbeats. On the mountain trail, through the window, Samuel could see Sheriff Morrison approaching, and behind him, a well-dressed stranger on a fine bay horse. Clara saw them too and moved closer to Samuel, her earlier ease replaced by wariness. Sheriff Morrison dismounted and approached the cabin with the stranger, a thin man in his 50s wearing an expensive coat and carrying himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. His cold blue eyes swept over the cabin with obvious distaste. "Samuel, Clara," Sheriff Morrison called out. "Like to have a word with you both." Samuel opened the door, noting how Clara positioned herself slightly behind him. The stranger stepped forward without waiting for an invitation. "I am Charles Pemberton," he announced, in a clipped Eastern accent, Clara's uncle. "I've come to take her home." Clara's sharp intake of breath was audible even to Samuel. She began signing rapidly, her movements agitated and fearful. Samuel didn't need to understand every sign to recognize panic when he saw it. "Clara doesn't seem pleased to see you," Sheriff Morrison observed. Watching the girl's frantic gestures, Charles Pemberton barely glanced at his niece. "The child has been indulged far too long in her unfortunate habits. My late brother and his wife filled her head with nonsense about that hand-waving business. What Clara needs is proper discipline and civilized society." Samuel reached for his paper and pencil, but Clara grabbed his arm, shaking her head. Instead, she moved to the table and wrote in large, defiant letters, "I don't want to go with him." "What you want is irrelevant," Charles replied coldly. "I am your legal guardian, and I have come to fulfill my duty to your late parents by providing you with a proper upbringing. You will accompany me to Boston, where arrangements have been made for your education at a school that specializes in correcting the unfortunate tendencies of children like yourself." The phrase "children like yourself" hung in the air like a curse. Samuel had heard similar words applied to himself over the years, the careful euphemisms people used when they meant broken or less than. Clara's face had gone pale, but her chin remained raised. She wrote, "My parents taught me that my hands have a voice." "You want to cut out my tongue," Charles Pemberton's mouth tightened. "Your parents filled you with romantic nonsense that has no place in civilized society. The school in Boston will teach you to communicate properly, like a normal child." Samuel watched Clara flinch at the word normal, and something hot and protective flared in his chest. He took the pencil from Clara and wrote in bold strokes, "She is normal. You're the one who can't understand her, I beg your pardon." Charles turned his cold gaze on Samuel. "I hardly think a hermit living in primitive conditions is qualified to judge what's best for my niece." Sheriff Morrison stepped forward. "Now hold on, Charles. I've been watching these two together, and the girl seems happier and more settled than she's been since she arrived in Cedar Ridge." "Happiness is a luxury," Charles replied dismissively. "What Clara needs is structure, discipline, and the opportunity to overcome her deficiencies. The school in Boston has an excellent record of success with her type." Clara was writing again, her pencil moving frantically across the paper. "I'm not deficient. I'm different. There's nothing wrong with me." But Charles wasn't interested in reading her words. He was already moving toward the door. "Clara, gather your things. We leave for the railroad station immediately." "Wait just a minute," Sheriff Morrison said. "Seems to me the girl should have some say in this matter." "Children don't make decisions about their own welfare," Charles replied firmly. "That's what adults are for. Clara's unfortunate circumstances have led to her being coddled and allowed to indulge in behavior that will handicap her for life. I intend to correct that." Samuel stood up slowly, his full height and mountain-hardened frame making him an imposing figure in the small cabin. He picked up the compass from the table, his father's compass that had guided the family safely through unknown territory, and placed it deliberately in Clara's hands. Then he wrote, "Some people find their way by following others. Some people find their way by listening to their own heart." Clara looked down at the compass, its needle pointing steadily north, and something shifted in her expression. She stood up straighter, no longer hiding behind Samuel, and faced her uncle directly. Her hands moved in deliberate, graceful signs as she spoke. Sheriff Morrison watched with growing understanding, while Charles Pemberton's face darkened with anger. "What is she saying?" Sheriff Morrison asked. Samuel wrote quickly. "She's saying that her parents taught her to be proud of who she is. She's saying that she chooses to stay here with someone who understands her language." "Enough," Charles snapped. "Clara, stop that ridiculous hand-waving immediately. You're coming with me, and that's final." But Clara shook her head and signed again, her movements more confident now. Samuel translated, "She says her parents taught her that love speaks in many languages, but it always speaks truth. She says you don't speak love." Sheriff Morrison looked between the well-dressed Eastern gentleman and the mountain man and orphan girl, who stood together like they'd found something worth defending. "Charles, maybe we should think about this." "There's nothing to think about," Charles interrupted. "I have legal documents establishing my guardianship. The child is coming with me." Clara moved closer to Samuel and took his hand. Her small fingers were warm against his calloused palm, and he felt the weight of her trust like a sacred responsibility. She looked up at him and signed something that made his eyes widen with surprise. "What did she say?" Sheriff Morrison asked quietly. Samuel's hand trembled slightly as he wrote, "She called me Papa." The word Papa hung in the air like a prayer answered and a challenge issued. Sheriff Morrison's eyes widened, and even Charles Pemberton seemed momentarily stunned by the simple declaration. Samuel stared down at Clara, this brave girl who had just claimed him as family with the fierce certainty that only children possess. "That's quite enough." Charles recovered his composure quickly. "Clara, you're being dramatic and inappropriate. This man is not your father." Clara's hands moved again, and Samuel translated with growing confidence. "She says blood doesn't make family. Love does." Sheriff Morrison removed his hat and ran his fingers through his graying hair. "Charles, I think we need to slow down here. The girls made her feelings pretty clear. Children's feelings are irrelevant when it comes to their welfare." Charles replied tersely. "I have a train to catch and arrangements to keep." "Clara, come along immediately," but Clara didn't move. Instead, she picked up the pencil and wrote in large, defiant letters, "No." The single word seemed to echo in the small cabin. Samuel felt something shift inside him. 28 years of accepting what others decided for him, of believing he had no right to want more than solitude and survival. Looking at Clara's determined face, he realized that some things were worth fighting for. He wrote carefully, "Sheriff Morrison, what would it take for me to become Clara's legal guardian?" Charles Pemberton's face flushed red. "Absolutely not. I won't allow my niece to be raised by some wild mountain man who can't even hear danger coming." "He hears me," Clara wrote quickly. "Better than anyone." Sheriff Morrison was thinking, his lawman's mind working through the complexities. Well, there'd need to be a hearing before Judge Williams. Clara's wishes would be considered, given her age and the circumstances. Character witnesses, proof of ability to provide for the child. "This is preposterous," Charles interrupted. "I'm her blood relative. I have legal standing and financial resources, and Clara has the right to be heard," Sheriff Morrison replied firmly. "Especially since she's been expressing her preferences quite clearly." Samuel moved to a wooden chest in the corner of his cabin and pulled out a small object wrapped in soft cloth. Inside was a carved wooden doll he'd made during the long winter evenings, a child's toy he'd created without conscious purpose, his hands carving away his loneliness in the shape of what he'd lost. He handed the doll to Clara, who unwrapped it with gentle fingers. The little figure was exquisitely detailed, with a kind face and tiny hands positioned in a welcoming gesture. Clara's eyes filled with tears as she examined the craftsmanship. "You made this?" she wrote. Samuel nodded. "Last winter. I didn't know why at the time." Clara hugged the doll to her chest and signed something that made Samuel's throat tighten with emotion. "What did she say?" Sheriff Morrison asked. "She said it looks like hope," Samuel wrote. Charles Pemberton stepped forward, his patience clearly exhausted. "This sentimentality is getting us nowhere. Clara, you're coming with me now, or I'll have the sheriff arrest this man for kidnapping." On what grounds? Sheriff Morrison asked sharply. The girl came to him during a storm. He provided shelter and safety. There's no crime in that. Then I'll take her by force if necessary. The threat hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Samuel stood slowly, his full height and mountain-hardened strength making him an imposing figure. For 28 years, he'd avoided confrontation, had accepted whatever others decided about his place in the world. But Clara's small hand in his had awakened something he'd thought was buried with his family. Sheriff, Samuel wrote, I formally request a hearing to petition for guardianship of Clara Pemberton. Granted, Sheriff Morrison replied immediately. Judge Williams can see you tomorrow morning. Charles Pemberton's face darkened with fury. This is ridiculous. I have important business to attend to. I can't waste time with some backwoods legal proceeding. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you came demanding to take a child who clearly doesn't want to go with you. Sheriff Morrison replied coolly. Clara was writing again, her pencil moving with determined strokes. I want to speak for myself at the hearing. I want everyone to understand what I'm saying. The judge doesn't know sign language, Sheriff Morrison said gently. Clara looked up at Samuel and signed something that made him smile for the first time since Charles. Pemberton had arrived. She says she'll teach me enough signs to translate for her, Samuel wrote. She says we have all evening to practice. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Samuel and Clara sat by the fire with paper and pencil, preparing for what might be the most important conversation of either of their lives. Clara patiently showed Samuel the signs for legal terms, for emotions, for the complex ideas she wanted to express to the judge. Samuel's hands were clumsy at first, too big and rough for the delicate language Clara spoke with such grace. But she was patient, adjusting his fingers gently, encouraging him when he grew frustrated with his mistakes. Why did you call me Papa? Samuel wrote during a break in their practice. Clara considered the question carefully before writing her response. Because you listen to my heart, not just my hands. Because you see me as complete, not broken. Because when I'm with you, I feel like I have a home. Samuel stared at her words until they blurred with moisture in his eyes. He picked up the pencil with a shaking hand and wrote, I haven't felt like I had a family since the mine accident. But sitting here with you, teaching each other our languages, it feels like coming home. Clara reached into her dress pocket and pulled out her silver locket, the one containing her parents' photograph. She opened it and showed Samuel the picture again, but this time she pointed to something he hadn't noticed before. In the corner of the photograph, barely visible, were two small hands, making the sign for love. My parents taught me that love is the only language that matters, Clara wrote. All the other words are just different ways of saying the same thing. Samuel understood then what Clara had known from the moment she'd stumbled into his cabin during the storm. They weren't just two broken people finding shelter together. They were family choosing each other, love speaking in whatever language the heart required. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in the valley below, Charles Pemberton was probably plotting legal strategies and making arrangements. But in the warm circle of firelight, Samuel and Clara practiced the words that would let them fight for each other, their hands learning to speak the same language of hope. As the first light of dawn crept through the cabin windows, Samuel sat at his small table, staring at an object he'd kept hidden for 28 years. Margaret's wedding ring lay before him, a simple gold band that had once symbolized a future full of promise. He'd worn it for 3 years after the mine accident, unable to accept that his wife was truly gone. When he'd finally removed it, he couldn't bring himself to bury it with her belongings. Instead, he'd wrapped it in a piece of cloth and hidden it away, a talisman of his capacity to love that he'd thought was lost forever. Clara stirred on the small cot he'd made for her near the fireplace, and Samuel quickly wrapped the ring back in its cloth. But she'd seen him holding it, had noticed the way his hands trembled as he put it away. Your wife's? She wrote on the slate they'd taken to using for quick communications. Samuel nodded, surprised by how easily she'd guessed. You still love her, Clara wrote. Always will, Samuel replied. But I'm learning that the heart has room for more than one kind of love. Clara studied his face with the serious expression she wore when processing something important. Then she wrote, "My parents taught me that love doesn't die. It just finds new ways to grow." Before Samuel could respond, they heard horses approaching the cabin. Through the window, he could see Sheriff Morrison riding up the trail, but he wasn't alone. Behind him came Tom Bradley, Doc Henderson, and several other men from town. Samuel's stomach tightened. Had Charles Pemberton convinced them to take Clara by force? But when the men dismounted, their faces weren't hostile. Tom Bradley carried a cloth bundle, and Doc Henderson had his medical bag. Sheriff Morrison approached the door with something that might have been a smile. "Morning, Samuel, Clara," he called out. "Mind if we come in? Got some folks here who'd like to speak with you before the hearing." Samuel opened the door, and the men filed into his cabin with the careful politeness of visitors rather than the aggressive authority of a posse. Tom Bradley set his bundle on the table and unwrapped it to reveal fresh bread, cheese, and apples from his store. "Figured you might be too nervous to cook much this morning," Tom said gruffly. "Big day ahead." Doc Henderson approached Clara with his kind, weathered face creased in concern. "Miss Clara, I wonder if you might show me some of those signs your hands make. I've been thinking it might be useful for a doctor to know a few words in your language." Clara's face lit up with surprise and pleasure. She began with simple signs. "Hello," "Thank you," "Help," and Doc Henderson tried to copy her movements with careful attention. His hands were gentler than Samuel's, more accustomed to delicate work, and he picked up the signs with surprising ease. "Remarkable," Doc murmured as Clara taught him the sign for medicine. "It's like watching poetry in motion." "No wonder your parents treasured this gift." Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat. "Samuel, we came to tell you that we'll be speaking on your behalf at the hearing." "All of us." Samuel's eyes widened in surprise. He reached for his pencil and wrote, "Why?" "Because we've been thinking about what that Eastern fellow said yesterday," Tom Bradley replied. "About Clara needing to be fixed and corrected. Made us realize we've been thinking about you the same way all these years." "You're not broken, Samuel," Doc Henderson added quietly. "You're just different. And difference isn't something that needs curing." Clara was watching this exchange with growing amazement. She wrote on her slate, "You're all learning signs." "Well, trying to," Sheriff Morrison said with a chuckle. "Doc here's got the best hands for it. Mine are too clumsy from handling ropes and reins. Practice makes better," Clara wrote, then demonstrated the sign for practice with patient repetition. As the men prepared to leave for town and the hearing, Tom Bradley pulled Samuel aside. "There's something else you should know," he said quietly. "That Pemberton fellow's been asking questions around town. About your past, your family, the mine accident. He's trying to build a case that you're not stable enough to raise a child." Samuel's jaw tightened. He wrote, "What did you tell him?" "The truth," Tom replied firmly. "That you've lived up here for 28 years without causing a lick of trouble for anyone. That you're honest, hard-working, and more reliable than half the men in town. That if he wants to question your character, he'll have to go through us first." Samuel stared at his old friend, overwhelmed by this unexpected loyalty. For so many years, he'd assumed the town saw him as nothing more than a curiosity or a burden. To learn that they'd been watching him with respect rather than pity was almost too much to process. Clara tugged on Samuel's sleeve and pointed to something she'd written. "They see what I see. You're a good man." As they prepared to leave for town and the hearing that would determine their future, Samuel found himself thinking about the ring hidden in his drawer. Margaret had believed in love's power to transform lives, to make people better than they thought they could be. Looking at Clara's determined face and remembering the gentle way the townsman had tried to learn her language, Samuel realized that love hadn't died with his wife. It had been waiting, patient as mountain stone, for the right moment to bloom again. The hearing was set for 10 o'clock at the courthouse, a simple wooden building that also served as the town hall and meeting place. As they walked down the mountain trail toward town, Clara slipped her small hand into Samuel's larger one. Her fingers were steady and warm, anchoring him to this moment that felt both terrifying and inevitable. "Whatever happens," Clara wrote on her slate as they paused at the edge of town, "you gave me something no one else could." "What's that?" Samuel wrote back. Clara looked up at him with those serious green eyes that held too much wisdom for someone so young. "You taught me that being different doesn't mean being alone." Samuel squeezed her hand gently, drawing strength from this remarkable child who had stumbled into his life and changed everything. As they walked toward the courthouse where their future would be decided, he carried Margaret's ring in his pocket, not as a reminder of loss, but as a symbol of love's enduring power to create family in the most unexpected ways. The town square was busier than usual, with people gathering for what had become the most talked-about event in Cedar Ridge's recent memory. Some faces showed curiosity, others concern, and a few displayed the kind of judgment that Samuel had grown accustomed to over the years. But there were also faces that offered encouragement, people who had begun to see past his silence to the man underneath. Whatever Judge Williams decided in that courthouse, Samuel knew that something fundamental had already changed. Clara had given him back his voice, and he had helped her find a place where that voice could be heard. Together, they had proven that love speaks all languages, and that family is made not by law or blood, but by the choice to see and accept each other completely. The courthouse was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and crowding near the windows. Judge Williams, a stern but fair man in his 60s, called the hearing to order with sharp raps of his gavel. Charles Pemberton sat at one table with a lawyer he'd brought from Denver, their expensive suits and polished shoes marking them as outsiders in this frontier town. Samuel and Clara sat at the opposite table with Sheriff Morrison, who had agreed to help present their case. "This hearing," Judge Williams announced, "it will determine the guardianship of Clara Marie Pemberton. Mr. Charles Pemberton claims legal guardianship as the child's uncle. Mr. Samuel Thorne has petitioned for the same guardianship. The court will hear from both parties and make a determination based on the best interests of the child." Charles Pemberton's lawyer stood first, a sharp-featured man named Whitman, who spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to winning. He painted a picture of Clara's future in Boston: fine schools, proper society, every material advantage money could buy. "Your Honor," Whitman concluded, "my client offers Miss Pemberton a life of refinement and opportunity. Mr. Thorne, while perhaps well-meaning, can offer only isolation and the primitive conditions of mountain life. Furthermore, his disability renders him incapable of providing the supervision and guidance a young girl requires." Samuel's hands clenched into fists at the word disability, but Clara placed her small hand over his, steadying him. Charles Pemberton himself took the stand next, his testimony delivered with cold efficiency. "Clara has been allowed to indulge in inappropriate behaviors that will handicap her for life. The hand gestures she makes are unseemly and mark her as abnormal. The school in Boston specializes in correcting such deficiencies. And what methods does this school employ?" Judge Williams asked. "Whatever methods are necessary," Charles replied. "Restraints if needed. Punishment for reverting to primitive gestures. The goal is to make Clara indistinguishable from any normal child." A murmur of discomfort rippled through the courtroom. Judge Williams frowned, but made no comment. Then it was time for Samuel and Clara to present their case. Sheriff Morrison stood first, speaking eloquently about what he'd observed between the mountain man and the orphan girl. Doc Henderson followed, demonstrating some of the signs Clara had taught him and explaining how sign language was a complete, sophisticated form of communication. Tom Bradley testified about Samuel's character, describing 28 years of honest dealings and quiet integrity. "He's never asked for charity, never caused trouble, never shown anything but respect for others, even when that respect wasn't returned." Finally, Judge Williams called Clara to testify. She walked to the front of the courtroom, with her head held high, her hands moving in careful, deliberate signs while Samuel translated her words. "I want to tell you about my parents," Clara began through Samuel's voice. "They were deaf like Mr. Samuel, but they weren't broken or deficient. They were whole, complete people who loved each other and loved me. They taught me that my hands have a voice, and that voice is just as important as anyone else's." The courtroom was silent except for Samuel's translation and Clara's graceful movements. "My uncle says there's something wrong with me that needs to be fixed. But Mr. Samuel sees me as I am and loves me as I am. He doesn't try to change me or make me into someone else. He just sees me." Charles Pemberton shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face darkening with every translated word. "I've been in 3 orphanages since my parents died," Clara continued. "In every one, they tried to make me stop signing. They said it was shameful, that I needed to be normal. But Mr. Samuel taught me that there are many ways to be normal, and all of them are good." Judge Williams watched Clara's hands with growing fascination. "Miss Pemberton, are you happy living with Mr. Thorne?" Clara's response came through her signs, and Samuel's voice. "Happy isn't big enough a word. With Mr. Samuel, I feel like I have a family again. I feel like I belong somewhere." Charles Pemberton could no longer contain himself. He stood abruptly, his voice cutting across the courtroom. "Your Honor, this is all very touching, but the law is clear. I'm Clara's legal guardian, appointed by her parents' will. I have documents to prove it." He nodded to his lawyer, who approached the bench with a leather portfolio. Inside were official documents, legal papers that made Charles Pemberton Clara's guardian, and more importantly, papers that revealed something that made Judge Williams's eyes widen with shock. "Mr. Pemberton," Judge Williams said slowly, "these documents indicate that Clara is not just your ward, but your heir. She stands to inherit a considerable fortune when she reaches majority." A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Samuel felt Clara's hand tighten in his as the implications became clear. Charles Pemberton's face had gone pale, but he recovered quickly. "Yes, Your Honor, my brother was quite successful in his business ventures. Clara will be a wealthy young woman someday, which is precisely why she needs proper guidance and education." But Judge Williams was studying the documents more carefully. "Mr. Pemberton, these papers also indicate that Clara's inheritance is held in trust, with you as the administrator. You have access to the funds for her care and education." "That's correct, Your Honor. And if Clara were to die before reaching majority, or if she were declared incompetent, the inheritance would pass to you as next of kin." The courthouse erupted in angry murmurs. Sheriff Morrison stood quickly, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. Samuel felt his blood run cold as the truth became clear. Charles Pemberton wasn't trying to save Clara from a life of signing and mountain isolation. He was trying to control her inheritance, and the school in Boston that specialized in correcting deficiencies was probably more prison than educational institution. Clara's hands moved in rapid, frightened signs, and Samuel translated her words with growing anger. "She says her parents warned her about Uncle Charles. They said he only cared about money, not family. They said if anything happened to them, she should never trust him with her future." Lies. Charles Pemberton shouted, "The child has been poisoned against me by these mountain primitives." But Judge Williams had seen enough. "Mr. Pemberton, these documents raise serious questions about your motivations. The court will need to investigate the nature of this Boston school and your management of Clara's trust fund." Charles Pemberton's composure cracked completely. "That money belongs to my family. My brother wasted it on his deaf wife and their defective daughter when it should have come to me." The courthouse fell silent at this outburst. Clara's face had gone white, but her hands moved with steady determination as she signed her response. Samuel's voice carried her words to every corner of the room. "She says her parents weren't defective, and neither is she. She says love isn't measured in dollars, and family isn't bought with inheritance money." Judge Williams brought his gavel down with authority. "Mr. Pemberton, based on your own statements and the evidence presented, I find you unfit to serve as Clara's guardian. Custody is hereby awarded to Samuel Thorne, pending formal adoption proceedings." The courtroom erupted in cheers, but Samuel barely heard them. He was watching Clara's face as she realized that she was truly safe, truly free to be herself. Her hands moved in signs that needed no translation. Pure joy, expressed in graceful gestures that spoke louder than any words. Charles Pemberton stormed from the courthouse with his lawyer, but not before making one final threat. This isn't over. I'll appeal this decision to Denver, to Washington if necessary. That money belongs to me. But his words carried no power anymore. Clara was home, and no amount of money could buy what she and Samuel had found together, a family built on understanding, acceptance, and the kind of love that speaks all languages. 3 days after the hearing, Samuel sat on his porch cleaning his father's hunting rifle, the same weapon that had fed his family through countless winters and had become as familiar to him as his own hands. He'd heard the rumors from town. Charles Pemberton hadn't left Cedar Ridge, as everyone expected. Instead, he'd taken rooms at the hotel and had been seen talking to rough-looking men who'd arrived on the afternoon train. Clara sat beside him, teaching signs to a rag doll she'd made from scraps of fabric. Her small fingers moved through the gestures with patient repetition, as if the doll were a real student learning to speak her language. There was a peacefulness to the scene that might have fooled a casual observer, but Samuel could see the tension in Clara's shoulders, the way her eyes darted toward the trail that led up from town. He's not going to give up, is he? Clara wrote on her slate. Samuel shook his head honestly. There was no point in lying to this child who had already seen too much of the world's cruelty. Charles Pemberton was the kind of man who saw Clara not as a person, but as a commodity, and men like that didn't accept defeat gracefully. Sheriff Morrison had visited that morning with troubling news. The federal marshals had been asking questions about the hearing, and there were rumors that Charles had contacted powerful friends in Washington. More immediately concerning were the 3 men who had checked into the hotel. Hard-faced strangers who carried themselves like hired guns. We might need to leave for a while, Samuel wrote. Go deeper into the mountains until this settles. Clara considered this, her young face serious. Then she wrote, running away didn't work before. It just made the bad people follow me. Samuel understood what she meant. They could disappear into the high country where he knew every trail and hidden valley, but that would mean living like fugitives, never knowing when danger might find them. Clara deserved better than a life spent looking over her shoulder. That evening, as they prepared for what might be their last peaceful night in the cabin, Clara surprised Samuel by pulling out her parents' silver locket. Inside the precious photograph, she carefully placed a new addition, a small piece of paper on which she'd written "My Family" in her careful handwriting. Above the words, she'd drawn 3 simple figures, a tall man, a small girl, and between them hands reaching toward each other in the sign for love. You're sure about this? Samuel wrote, understanding the significance of her, including him in her most treasured possession. Clara nodded and signed something that made Samuel's throat tighten with emotion. She says her parents would be happy to know you're taking care of me, Samuel whispered to himself, since there was no one else to translate for. As night fell, Samuel made careful preparations. He loaded his rifle and placed it by the door. He showed Clara the hidden root cellar beneath the cabin floor, where she could hide if necessary. He wrote out detailed instructions for reaching Tom Bradley's store if they became separated, and he gave her a pouch containing money and supplies. I don't want to hide, Clara wrote when she saw the preparations. I want to stand with you. Samuel knelt before her, taking her small hands in his large, weathered ones. Sometimes the bravest thing is knowing when to be safe, he wrote. Your parents trusted me to protect you. Let me do that. Clara studied his face in the firelight, reading the determination there. Finally, she nodded and signed something that Samuel was beginning to recognize as her way of saying, I trust you. They were awakened near midnight by the sound of horses on the mountain trail. Samuel moved to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. 4 men on horseback were approaching the cabin, moving with the careful stealth of hunters stalking prey. In the moonlight, he could see the glint of weapons. Clara was already awake, her eyes wide but unafraid. Samuel pointed toward the root cellar, and she moved quietly to the hidden entrance. Before she disappeared below the floor, she caught Samuel's arm and signed, "Be careful, Papa." The word "Papa" strengthened Samuel's resolve like nothing else could have. For 28 years, he'd had nothing worth fighting for except his own survival. Now he had Clara, this brave, beautiful child who had given him back his purpose and his heart. Samuel took position by the window with his rifle, watching as the men dismounted and surrounded his cabin. He recognized one of them from town, a hired gun Charles Pemberton had brought from Denver. The others were strangers, but their intent was clear from the way they moved, from the weapons they carried, from the predatory patience in their approach. A voice called out from the darkness. Charles Pemberton himself, though he stayed well back from the cabin. "Thorne, I know you can't hear me, but I know you can see us. Send the girl out and no one gets hurt. This doesn't have to end badly." Samuel's hands moved in the sign Clara had taught him for liar, though no one was there to see it. "Men like Charles Pemberton didn't make offers they intended to keep. We're going to give you 1 minute to think about it," the voice continued. "Then we're coming in anyway. The girl's inheritance is too valuable to leave in the hands of a mountain hermit and a defective child." Samuel thought about the life Clara would face if these men succeeded. The school in Boston would break her spirit as surely as chains would break her body. Charles Pemberton would control her inheritance until she came of age, if she ever did. And if Clara proved too difficult to manage, too resistant to being corrected, Samuel had no doubt that accidents could be arranged for wealthy heiresses who were too much trouble. The thought filled him with a cold, protective fury that he hadn't felt since the day he'd lost his family. Some things were worth fighting for, and some fights were worth dying for. Clara was both. Samuel checked his rifle one last time and settled into position. He'd spent 28 years avoiding conflict, accepting whatever the world decided he deserved. But Clara had taught him that he deserved more than mere survival. He deserved love, family, the right to protect what mattered most. Outside, the men were moving into position. Inside, Samuel prepared to show them that the quiet mountain man had depths they never suspected, and that love could make even the gentlest soul dangerous when cornered. The battle for Clara's future was about to begin, and Samuel intended to finish it once and for all. The first shot shattered the cabin's front window, sending glass cascading across the floor where Clara had been sitting just minutes before. Samuel felt the vibration through the wooden walls and knew the time for waiting had ended. He aimed carefully through the broken window and fired back, his shot precise enough to send one of the hired men diving for cover behind a large pine tree. Samuel's years in the mountains had taught him patience and strategy. These men might have numbers and professional experience, but they were fighting on his ground, in terrain he knew better than his own heartbeat. More importantly, they were fighting for money, while he was fighting for family. From his position by the window, Samuel could see Charles Pemberton hanging back near the horses, well out of range, but close enough to direct his hired guns. The man's cowardice was evident in every line of his body. He was willing to pay others to do his dirty work, but wouldn't risk his own precious skin. Another shot splintered the wooden frame near Samuel's head, and he dropped low, reloading with practiced efficiency. 28 years of hunting mountain game had made his movements automatic, his aim deadly accurate. These men might be professionals, but Samuel had something they lacked: the desperation of a father protecting his child. A sound from below made Samuel's heart skip. Clara was moving in the root cellar, and he realized she must be able to feel the vibrations from the gunfire through the cabin floor. He moved quickly to the hidden entrance and tapped twice on the wood, a signal they'd arranged to let her know he was all right. 2 taps came back from below, Clara's way of saying she was safe and trusting him to keep her that way. Samuel returned to his position just as one of the men tried to circle around to the cabin's back door. Through a rear window, Samuel saw the figure moving through the shadows and fired a warning shot that sent the man scrambling back toward the tree line. Getting tired yet, old man? One of the hired guns called out. We can keep this up all night. You've only got so many bullets. Samuel didn't waste energy on a response they couldn't hear anyway. Instead, he carefully counted his remaining ammunition and thought about the layout of his property. He knew every rock, every tree, every possible approach to the cabin. These men were operating blind, but he could navigate this terrain in complete darkness. The sound of hoofbeats made Samuel look toward the trail leading up from town. At first, his heart sank. He thought Charles Pemberton had brought reinforcements. But as the riders emerged from the darkness, Samuel recognized Sheriff Morrison's distinctive silhouette, followed by Tom Bradley, Doc Henderson, and several other men from Cedar Ridge. The cavalry had arrived, but they were coming into the middle of a firefight. Charles Pemberton's voice rose above the chaos. "Sheriff, these men are helping me reclaim my legal ward from a kidnapper. I demand you arrest Samuel Thorne." Sheriff Morrison's response carried clearly across the mountain air. "The only kidnapping I see is you bringing armed men to terrorize a child. Drop your weapons immediately." What followed was a confused moment where allegiances became clear. The hired guns looked to Charles Pemberton for orders, while the townsmen spread out to surround the entire group. Samuel could see the uncertainty on the gunmen's faces. They'd been hired to intimidate an isolated mountain man, not to fight half the town of Cedar Ridge. In that moment of hesitation, something extraordinary happened. The church bell began to toll, not the regular Sunday call to worship, but the rapid, urgent pealing that signaled danger to the entire community. Someone in town had awakened to the sound of gunfire and was calling for help, the bell that had never rung for. Samuel Thorne was now calling the community to his defense. Windows began lighting up in the valley. Below, as Cedar Ridge awakened to the crisis, Samuel could see lanterns moving along the streets as more people emerged from their homes, drawn by the urgent call of the bell. Charles Pemberton's voice cracked with frustrated rage. "This is ridiculous! I'm trying to claim my rightful ward and her inheritance. These people have no legal authority. The only authority I need," Sheriff Morrison replied, "is the authority to protect the citizens of this town from armed thugs. And right now, that includes Samuel Thorne and Clara Pemberton." Samuel felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the adrenaline of the fight. For 28 years, he'd believed he was alone, that the town saw him as an outsider to be tolerated at best. But Sheriff Morrison had just called him a citizen, one of their own worth protecting. The hired guns were beginning to realize that their simple job had become complicated. What should have been a quick grab of a child and her guardian had turned into a standoff with an entire community. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and fighting people who had every legal and moral right to be there. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, with guns trained in all directions, and Charles Pemberton's hired men beginning to realize they'd walked into something far more complicated than a simple kidnapping. In the growing tension, Samuel heard something that made his blood run cold. Movement in the root cellar below. Clara was coming up. Samuel moved quickly to the hidden entrance. But before he could stop her, Clara's small hand appeared, followed by her determined face. She ignored Samuel's frantic gestures to stay hidden and climbed fully into the cabin. "Clara, no!" Samuel wrote quickly on his slate, but she shook her head with the stubborn courage that had brought her through 2 years of orphanages and cruel guardians. Clara moved to the broken front window where she could be seen by everyone outside. In the pale moonlight, her small figure was clearly visible to both the hired guns and the townspeople who had come to help. Then with deliberate grace, she began to sign. Her hands moved in fluid, purposeful gestures, not random movements, but clear, articulate speech that demanded attention. Samuel realized what she was doing and felt his heart swell with pride and terror in equal measure. Clara was speaking for herself, refusing to let others decide her fate. Sheriff Morrison called out, "Samuel, what's the girl saying?" Samuel moved to the window beside Clara, his own hands now moving with the signs she'd taught him. His voice carried across the mountain air as he translated, She says she's not property to be bought and sold. She says she chooses her own family. Clara's hands moved again, more emphatically now, and Samuel continued. She says Uncle Charles doesn't want a niece. He wants money. She says real family doesn't need inheritance papers to prove love. The hired guns shifted uncomfortably. They'd signed on to intimidate a mountain hermit, not to threaten a child who was eloquently defending herself in front of half a town. Charles Pemberton's voice rose in frustrated fury. "Enough of this nonsense. Men, take the girl. I'll triple your pay." But something had changed in the hired gun's demeanor. They'd seen Clara's brave stand, had watched a child refuse to be cowed by armed men and harsh threats. Even hardened mercenaries had lines they weren't comfortable crossing. The eldest of the hired men, a grizzled veteran with silver hair, slowly lowered his weapon. "I didn't sign on to terrorize children, Pemberton. This job's done." "What?" Charles sputtered. "I'm paying you to follow orders." "You're paying us to collect a runaway ward," the man replied. "But that girl doesn't look like she's running from anything. She looks like she's running to something. There's a difference." One by one, the other hired guns followed their leader's example, lowering their weapons and stepping back from the conflict. They'd been hired to do a job, but they weren't willing to become child kidnappers for any amount of money. With his hired muscle abandoning him, Charles Pemberton found himself alone, facing a town full of people who had clearly chosen sides. His face contorted with rage and desperation as he realized his carefully laid plans were crumbling. "Fine," he shouted, pulling out a small pistol from his coat. "If you won't help me, I'll take what's mine myself." Charles Pemberton began walking toward the cabin, his weapon raised, his face twisted with the fanatical determination of a man who had lost everything and blamed everyone but himself. This was no longer about money or legal guardianship. This was about a man's pride and his refusal to accept defeat. Samuel stepped in front of Clara, shielding her with his body, but she moved around him with surprising speed. Before anyone could stop her, Clara walked out of the cabin and stood on the porch, facing her uncle directly. Her hands moved in signs that needed no translation. They were the gestures of someone saying goodbye, of someone cutting ties that should never have bound her in the first place. Samuel moved to stand beside her, and together they faced Charles Pemberton, uncle and niece, separated by more than the few yards of mountain ground between them. They were separated by completely different ideas about what family meant, what love looked like, what made a life worth living. "Last chance, Clara," Charles said, his voice shaking with fury and desperation. "Come with me now, or I'll make sure you never see a penny of your inheritance." Clara's response came through her hands and Samuel's voice. "She says you can keep the money. She's already rich." "Rich?" Charles laughed bitterly. "Look around you. This mountain poverty is what you call rich." Clara signed again, and Samuel translated with growing emotion. "She says she has a father who understands her language, a community that accepts her as she is, and the freedom to be herself. She says that's worth more than all the money in Boston." For a moment, Charles Pemberton's face showed something that might have been doubt, a flicker of understanding about what he was trying to destroy. But greed and pride won out, and he raised his pistol with shaking hands. "Then you can have your mountain paradise," he said. "But you'll have it without him." The shot that followed echoed across the mountains like thunder, but it didn't come from Charles Pemberton's gun. Sheriff Morrison's rifle had spoken first, and Charles crumpled to the ground, his weapon falling harmlessly from nerveless fingers. In the sudden silence that followed, Clara turned to Samuel and signed something that made him smile, despite everything they'd just endured. What did she say? Sheriff Morrison called out as he approached to check on Charles Pemberton. Samuel looked down at this remarkable child who had taught him about courage, about family, about the power of love to transform lives. She said, "Welcome home, Papa." As the first light of dawn painted the mountains in shades of gold and rose, Samuel reached into his pocket and pulled out the adoption papers that Judge Williams had prepared. With hands that shook only slightly with emotion, he signed his name and made their family official. 6 months later, The spring thaw had transformed the mountains around Cedar Ridge into a symphony of rushing water and budding life. Samuel stood on his porch, watching Clara teach sign language to a group of children from town who had climbed the trail to their cabin for their weekly lesson. Her hands moved with patient grace as she showed them the signs for friendship, understanding, and family. The children, ranging in age from 6 to 14, followed her movements with the intense concentration of students learning something precious. Among them was young Tommy Bradley, Tom's grandson, who had become Clara's closest friend and most dedicated student. His pudgy fingers struggled with the delicate gestures, but Clara encouraged him with the same patience she'd shown Samuel during those early days. "Remember," Clara signed as Samuel translated, "signing isn't just moving your hands, it's sharing your heart." The children practiced the new signs with enthusiastic clumsiness, their laughter carrying across the mountain air like music. Watching them, Samuel marveled at how naturally they accepted this new language, how easily they embraced what their parents had once feared. Doc Henderson had become a regular visitor to the cabin, bringing his medical bag and his growing vocabulary of medical signs. He'd discovered that having a way to communicate silently with patients was invaluable, especially children who were frightened or in pain. Clara had become his unofficial teacher and he hers, as she learned signs for medical terms that might help other deaf people who came through Cedar Ridge. "She's got a gift," Doc had told Samuel the week before. "Not just for signing, but for teaching. She makes people want to understand." Tom Bradley had surprised everyone by announcing that his general store would now employ someone who could communicate with deaf customers. A young man from Denver who had heard about Cedar Ridge's welcoming attitude toward the deaf community. Word was spreading along the Frontier Telegraph about the small mountain town where sign language was as welcome as spoken words. Sheriff Morrison had become something of a local celebrity after the showdown with Charles Pemberton. The story of the lawman who stood up to Eastern money and hired guns had been picked up by newspapers as far away as Denver and San Francisco. But Morrison brushed off the attention, saying he'd simply done what any decent person would do: protect a child and defend a neighbor. Charles Pemberton had survived his encounter with Sheriff Morrison's rifle, though he'd spend the rest of his life with a limp and a reminder of the night he'd tried to steal a child's future for money. The federal investigation into his management of Clara's trust fund had revealed years of embezzlement and fraud. He was currently serving time in the territorial prison, and Clara's inheritance, now managed by honest trustees in Denver, would wait for her until she came of age. Clara had shown surprisingly little interest in the money, though she'd been fascinated by the legal process. "I want to be a lawyer someday," she'd written to Samuel, "so I can help other children who don't have anyone to speak for them." The cabin itself had grown to accommodate their expanding family life. Samuel had built an addition with a proper bedroom for Clara and a larger common room where her students could gather. The walls were decorated with Clara's drawings, pictures that told the story of their life together through images of hands reaching toward each other, mountains embracing valleys, and small figures finding their way home. On the mantelpiece sat a new family portrait that Clara had drawn, a more complete version of the sketch she'd put in her locket. It showed Samuel and Clara standing together on their mountain, but now they were surrounded by other figures. The townspeople who had become their extended family, the children who came to learn, the friends who had discovered that difference was something to celebrate rather than fear. As the afternoon lesson wound down and the children prepared to head back to town, Clara approached Samuel with something in her hands. It was a carved wooden frame containing a piece of paper covered with her careful handwriting. "What's this?" Samuel signed, his hands now moving with the fluid grace of someone truly fluent in Clara's language. Clara's response came in signs that needed no translation. "It's my story." "Our story. I wrote it down so people will remember that families come in all shapes, and love speaks all languages." Samuel read the first few lines of Clara's story, written in her neat handwriting. "Once there was a man who lived in silence. And once there was a girl who spoke with her hands. The world told them they were broken, but they found each other and discovered they were whole. This is the story of how two people who were different learned they were exactly the same, where it mattered most, in their hearts. Tears blurred Samuel's vision as he read Clara's words. In the margins of the paper, she'd drawn small illustrations, hands reaching toward each other. A cabin nestled among mountains. A community gathered around a courthouse, and at the bottom of the page, two figures standing together beneath a sky full of stars. "It's beautiful," Samuel signed. "But it's not finished yet, is it?" Clara grinned and signed back. "No, Papa, we have lots more story to write together." As the sun set behind the mountains and Clara waved goodbye to her students, Samuel reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. He thought about the mine accident that had taken his hearing and his first family, about the 28 years of silence and isolation that had followed. He thought about the storm that had brought Clara to his door, about the courage it had taken for both of them to reach across the silence and find each other. Most of all, he thought about the lesson Clara had taught not just him, but an entire community, that communication isn't about the words you speak, but about the willingness to listen with your heart. That family isn't about blood or law, but about choosing to see and accept each other completely. That love speaks all languages, and the most important conversations happen when people care enough to learn each other's way of talking. Inside the cabin, Clara was already preparing for tomorrow's lesson, writing out new vocabulary words and practicing signs that would help her students express more complex ideas. She looked up as Samuel entered and signed, "What are you thinking about, Papa?" Samuel sat down beside his daughter, for that's what she truly was now, in every way that mattered, and signed back, "I'm thinking about how quiet my life was before you came. I thought silence was the same as peace." Clara tilted her head, considering his words. "And now I know that silence is only peaceful when you choose it," Samuel signed. "When someone forces it on you, it's just loneliness pretending to be wisdom." Clara reached over and took his weathered hand in her small one. "You taught me something too, Papa." "What's that?" "You taught me that being different isn't something to hide from. It's something to share with people who are brave enough to understand." As they sat together in the golden light of the oil lamp, working on tomorrow's lesson plans and sharing the comfortable quiet that only true family knows, Samuel understood that Clara had given him more than just a daughter. She had given him back his voice, his place in the world, and his faith in the possibility of connection. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the sounds of a community that had learned to speak a new language, the language of acceptance, understanding, and love. And in the warm circle of lamplight, two people who had once been alone in the world discovered that they would never be alone again. The story Clara had written was far from over. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, new opportunities to build bridges across the spaces that separate people. But tonight, they had each other. They had their chosen family in Cedar Ridge, and they had the knowledge that love truly does speak all languages. You just have to be willing to learn.